And we are back with another episode of the Artisans of the Horizon, and we are with Dr. Theodore Richards in Chicago. Uh, Theodore, will you tell us a little bit about yourself to open up our episode?
Yeah, sure. I live here on the south side of Chicago with my wife and my three daughters. Since I moved here about 11 years ago, I've been running a project called the Chicago Wisdom Project. We've recently grown into a national organization and have partners in various cities, including the Baltimore Wisdom Project. We now go by the name Wisdom Projects Incorporated. And our mission is generally to work in holistic educational settings. We work with youth to help them reimagine their stories, to empower them to reimagine their stories so they can become teachers and really revolutionaries in this new world that's being birthed. And we do a lot of work with them through the arts. I'm a writer. I've written 7 books and some poetry, some fiction, and some philosophy. And I think that's maybe all I can say right now.
Lovely. This whole series is about showcasing, different creative, prophetic, revolutionary people who are actively trying to co-create and co-birth a new world, an emerging world. Because I think really we oftentimes buy into this archetype words archetype of a that we have part A, this is the beginning part of our story, and then something happens and then we have to move into a part B. And I think there's nothing really necessarily wrong with that construct, but it's actually the mystics and the educators and the prophets have always said that, it's actually not that much of a binary. It's actually a fluid reality. And it's a reality that while we are here in this moment, there's actually stuff underneath everything that's bubbling up, that's trickulating, that's inspiring our consciousness, that's inspiring our dreams, the way we show up in the world, whether we know it or not. And at certain points into our life, I like to say that we stumble upon certain ideas, or we stumble upon certain words that tap into those realities that we didn't always know we were operating on. And that's ultimately what it means to be an artist, somebody who's tuned in to these to the ether, to these cosmic forces, to the world around us, so that we can paint a new painting, paint a picture of what's actually happening. And that's what it means to be an artisan of the horizon, which is why I wanted to create this series to showcase all those different people who are doing that. In your work as a professor, as a writer, as a prophet in your age and your time frame, how do you feel that you've been able to tap into some of that reality and help see the world that's emerging?
Well, that's a big question. I think that for me, I think that I was just saying, before we came on live, I was saying how, for a long time, some of us have been seeing how it was inevitable that there'd be something like a collapse and a rebirth of maybe human civilization, certainly Western industrial civilization, given all of the contradictions and problems with capitalist civilization that we see. I think that we've been heading inevitably toward a collapse, given the incredible growth and the requirement for exploitation that we see all around us, requirement to exploit nature, requirement to exploit other people, and increasingly forced into this kind of requirement to ask of people to identify themselves increasingly as isolated individuals who only get meaning and purpose in life through that which they can buy, right? And that's the way, and the way I like to say that the way the way you can convince someone to buy stuff they don't need, that's really what our civilization is built upon right now, is convincing half of the population to buy stuff that they don't need in order to exploit the other half of the population. And so, you know, I'm using half loosely here, but it's probably not half, but this idea that, and the way you do that is you really make someone feel that they're alone in the universe. And I've been, one of the things I've been reflecting on throughout the pandemic is how all of my work has been, and this is actually like some deep personal work that I've done. And I've reflected on the fact that all of my work has been, whether it's sort of philosophical work or fiction I've written, or work I've done in the community, it's all been about kind of rediscovering our sense of place in the world and our sense of intimacy with the world, in order really to fall in love with the world. And there's this sort of, I feel like there's this struggle that we have with the forces that would tell us that we're ultimately alone. I like to say that, an individualized, I'd much prefer a fleeting moment of genuine intimacy to eternal salvation that's individualized, and alone. So I think that's where we've reached, and I think this kind of, I use the framing of apocalypse a lot, and I think that we can talk more about that, but I'll just say briefly that I think that the apocalypse in many ways is an apocalypse of loneliness, that we've reached the kind of edge of our capacity to function in this world as isolated individuals. And that's really where we've reached the limit of this civilization.
That's so good. That's so perfect. I love it. Everything you just said, I was like, wow, that's awesome. I wish I was this wise. But I love that word intimacy, because I have been reflecting upon that too. As I was sharing before we started this conversation, we started recording. I've been for the past 4 weeks rather, ish, going through a very deep interaction with the coronavirus, COVID-19, having to deal first with my father, with two people in the house that I reside in, both my parents, having to deal with that virus coming. First, my dad came down with it very quickly, got very sick. We weren't sure, what to deal with it, and we just kind of had to keep our feet on the ground and kind of just address things as we could, and then leave room for possibility. And then, after that 2 weeks, he got better. Well, then my mother got sick, but then she got sick and she was asymptomatic. So it was really more like for her at least, it was really more a mental battle of trying to learn to live into her body when there was something in her body that was working against her body, but her body wasn't showing it, which is, I think, is a very symbolic reality of a lot of us in this world, that we don't realize that there are a lot of people who are fighting wars inside of them, but who are so good at buying into this culture that tells us to look good all the time. Even if you are really at the edge of your rope, you still need to look good because of what you just said. We can't have that level of intimacy. In churches, when I preach in churches, I often say that we're always told in seminary, especially those who are ordained, we're always told in seminary our job is to save souls and things like that. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, at least in the case of Jesus, when I look at Jesus' story, I never saw him save any souls. I saw him save bodies. He resurrected Lazarus. He healed everybody that he touched, and he confronted actually and insulted the institutions that were more focused on the the superficial and the the soul realm, I guess you could say, or the soul reality. And that's not to that's not to say that those things don't matter, but it's important to realize that the body is absolutely necessary in this reality. But this whole word of intimacy, I've been reflecting on that, on what it means to be intimate, how we're being forced into really delving deeper into that reality, and learning that intimacy is very risky.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah,
It's far easier to take a pill that'll make you feel better, or buy something new that'll make you feel better, or just kind of dull your senses, I think sterility is,
yeah.
I think, one of the kind of core values of the civilization we live in, isn't it? And homogeneity, I like to say that, we exist and here we are, like on Zoom, right? But I think long before the pandemic hit, and there's good reasons to be on Zoom during a pandemic, but I think long before the pandemic hit, we functioned in these screen worlds in which I think it was so much less risky, because what we didn't have to do is bring our full embodied selves into the space, into the interaction. We could create a two-dimensional image of ourselves, which
Mhm.
not only is it disembodied, but it has two dimensions. It doesn't have the dimension of depth. And so that kind of intimacy we get with kind of really, really kind of engaging someone on a deep level is not there, because we can present a side of ourselves that looks okay, and it's so toxic to have this culture in which everyone's presenting their best self all the time. Think about how that inhibits real growth,
Mhm.
because everyone's like, you know, um, I see a lot with young people, they're so kind of thinking, and I can remember this to some extent when I was like an adolescent, thinking about, because I've often reflected back on this, into my own adolescence, how I perceived other people my age as kind of like having their stuff together, and now I look back and I'm like, obviously they didn't, you know what I mean? They were like traumatized and depressed and everything else, just like everyone else was, you know what I mean? And I think we've created a civilization in which that's sort of like that whole like adolescent thing is like on steroids now for everyone, So, and again, it makes people better consumers, I think, to have that sort of mentality. But that genuine intimacy is lost, and I like to think about the texture of the world is lost,
Mm.
what I mean? That kind of like uh the way in which our world can be not so kind of easily replicated and sterile, but a little messy,
Well, that's really interesting too that you bring that up, because that's something that in the back of my mind, as we've been going through this pandemic, it's something that I keep coming back to. Um, I always say I wasn't really the kid in school that was like super into math and all that stuff. I really hate numbers, which is quite ironic given that I'm a classically trained musician and we use a lot more math than we probably allow ourselves to believe. Um, but one of the things I really loved, and I've always liked science to a certain extent, but the science that I really liked was biology, um, because I just thought it was so fascinating. Partly because I was born with a genetic birth defect, a couple of them that required extensive amounts of surgery. Um, so I spent a lot of time in doctor's offices and operating rooms and ICUs, all that kind of stuff. So I joke when I say I live in Houston, and we have the world's largest medical center. And I always joke with people that I probably helped pay to put most of those doctors through medical school with all of those operations that I had and my family had and everything. And so I understand, and I've always had a fascination about the way that the body works and how our body is responding to stimulus and everything. And one of my friends who's been on this series, Reverend Judy Schutt, likes to talk about body wisdom, and has this practice of asking your body, what is it that you have to tell me, and that when you get pain, it's not a way of your body like uh, being like abusing itself. It's a way of your body saying, hey, there's something going on. I need you to give attention to me. I need you to be intimate with me. And but one of the things that's always been in the back of my mind as this pandemic has been going on is this whole thing with sanitizers, which I actually have a bottle here. Is one of the things I learned in biology was that there is such a thing as good bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
good germs, and that, and in fact, when we talked about food, uh, fermentation is about creating that good bacteria. So that your gut can help with digestion and things like that. And we know that fermentation and having a proper amount of it uh, helps to keep us to live longer and to live more robust lives. Um, but one of the things I've been noticing about this pandemic and this using of soap and hand sanitizer and things like that is I think we are inadvertently reinforcing this idea of sterilization, of perfection, of um, of not being okay with taking risk. Um, and that I think is problematic in the way that it doesn't allow for us to be willing to get messy with people. Um, and I like to say that, you know, we can't have a message without having a mess. Um, and sometimes to find your message, you got to go and jump into, you know, into the deep end and get dirty a little bit um, and explore those areas. So I don't know. Can you reflect a little bit on that? How do you feel like that relates to your life and your work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the pandemic, it 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 brings all these kind of new concerns that we didn't have before, and new kind of calculations about how we have to live. Some of which are, well, it's like many things in life. It often becomes a question of you know um, uh, choosing among bad and uncomfortable choices rather than good ones. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? I think of it with my children, right? So I have to, we have to make a decision between not sending them to school, which does certain amount of harm. I have more than one child, so they have each other. We have a sort of vibrant family life, and they're not lonely in the same way that an only child would be. But still, there's so many benefits of going to school socially anyway.
Hmm.
And then, but sending them to school would bring about, genuine risk. And even more than that, the thing about sending them to school for me that is troubling is the amount of kind of how limited they'll be in school. Particularly my younger ones. I have a 5 and a 6 and a 12-year-old, right? My little ones, the notion of my 5-year-old wearing a mask all day and having to be 6 feet apart from everyone, not being able to touch the toys and not being able to, you know what I mean? It seems everything that would be good about school is removed, in that process. I think that, there are all these difficult choices to make in that, but I think in the bigger picture, I think that, and the reality is that while in the short term, I think it's much, we obviously have to, keep our hands clean, right, in the short term. But in the long term, if we really think about what's going on here with the pandemic, and let's just to be a little bit more, just to be scientific about it, not metaphorical, but we can go there too. Like, it's the product of our encroachment into wild spaces.
Mm.
It's a product of our paving over of the world, the way I look at it, which paving over wild spaces, which paves over something wild in ourselves, I think, so I think that we've been so quick to kind of get rid of those wild spaces. And that's the messiness that you're talking about, right? We've always, I think, throughout human history had this kind of interplay, maybe commingling, but certainly interaction between the kind of uh, uh, culture and safety of human civilization, and then the wild spaces in which that we're absolutely dependent upon. And most human cultures, until very recently, understood this. We, as kind of modern capitalist culture, do not understand that. and we've increasingly encroached in wild spaces, and one of the products of that has been these new pandemics that are arising, and they'll keep coming, and people who study this knew it was coming eventually, and until we begin to have a healthier kind of interaction with the wildness of the world, we won't stop pandemics from coming, no matter how much we sanitize our hands. And you know, and also, I think we won't stop encroaching on wild spaces until we come to terms with the wildness in ourselves. I think that's the other important piece of this, and become comfortable with ourselves, not just as kind of sterile, you know, Facebook pages, but actually like three-dimensional, embodied, messy people, you know?
Yeah, and grumpy people, people who have bad days, people who are okay with saying, "I'm just not in a good mood. I don't. It's not that I don't like you. It's just that
Mm,
I'm just not in a good mood right now." You know, and yeah, learning to negotiate not just boundaries necessarily, but um, capacities for holding space. Uh, And I mean, the other day I was just having a day where I was like, you know what, just nobody, don't even look at me. Just stay away, because one false move and I will lose it. And it was, you know, it's just one of those days. I'm quite dramatic, so I have those days every once in a while. I come from a very dramatic family, so it's okay. But I told somebody, I told my mother, it's like, you know, today, I just cannot, I do not have the capacity to manage people's extraness, like, you know, like all the time, like, you know, eccentricities, you know, their neediness, their anger, their frustration, their passive aggressive behavior, those little things that people do to you that just like chip away at you, you know, that you can kind of like let go when it's happening or whatever. There's just subtle little abuses that people do, and that we have been taught that it's okay to do. You know, I was just having one of those days where I was just like, I can't deal with that. But I think allowing people to have that right, that they have that right to be like that and to be in that mood, and recognizing too how you reinforce in your own way, whether you know it or not, the violent culture that we live in. And I think part of doing that is getting back to the wild, learning to interact in a holistic way with non-human animals.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and learning to realize that they have a world too. They have a way of being in this world that they want to be able to live, um, and we don't necessarily have the right to intervene in that reality and
mhm.
ruin that. You know, dolphins, for instance. I think it's dolphins or whales. No, it might be whales. I don't remember. I have to go back and look it up. I was reading this article about either dolphins or whales, and they were saying that they have very broad and very real and intense lives, and they seem to give off the impression that they have a consciousness about their life, um, and that they have like almost like they have goals about what they want to strive to and how many kids they want to have and things like that.
Mm, mm,
And when I remember reading it, my first thought was, wow, like the creator is really good. You know, like the creator and the creation is really just great. And I had a sense of awe, you know, the via positiva in creation spirituality. Um, but then, you know, as we're taught in creation spirituality, you know, you can't stay in the positive because the positive always leads into the negative, and the negative is the fact that there are a lot of people who are not willing to have that experience of recognizing the sacredness in this reality. Um, and so, yeah, again, I think that goes back to resolving that goes back to what you said about having a more of an understanding of the wild in ourselves, that we are not separated from this world, but that we are deeply intrinsically a part of the cosmic story, the melody of this world's song.
Y-
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we're you know, I mean, the if it's all positive, you get this kind of toxic positivity, right? You
Yeah.
get like prosperity gospel and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Which I know is your favorite. But but you know, this sort of like, I mean, but you get in like new age circles as well as in
Hmm.
evangelical circles, right? This notion that everything has got to be positive, positive, positive. You know, I mean, you've got to move through and integrate the negative too, right? But I also wanted to say, you know, as you're talking about the whales or the dolphins, whichever, it doesn't matter, maybe it's both. You know, the whole way of thinking about other species is problem that we generally have is problematic. We generally, first of all, it's problematic because we think of them like, you know, we sort of assess the value of an animal, right, but based on their proximity to us or value to us or ways in which they seem intelligent to us. You know, I mean, ants are as intelligent as humans. They're just intelligent in ant-like ways. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, any species of animal, you know, the bacterium is as intelligent as us. Like, we can't do what the bacterium does. And it's a value because we're entangled and with those species and rely on those species as a whole. You know what I mean? So like this whole notion of kind of competition and separation among different species, I think is highly problematic. And it's really, it's not the product of any kind of science or anything observable. It's actually the product of a culture that values competition and individuality, you know?
Yeah.
And you see it, you know, as an educator, I see how this value of competition is essentially the way we've structured, we've organized our schools and our education systems as a way to reinforce that notion that we are individuals in competition with each other rather than in relationship with each other and working together, you know? So those are these kind of values that I think we have to really, really challenge. And they're not as easy to challenge as we might think, you know what I mean? Because it's like, you know, we might think, well, yeah, I kind of disagree with that, but we don't realize how woven into the fabric of our lives in every way those values are. That's what happens when you have like, this is a cosmological
Hmm.
issue. It's a cultural issue. When I say cosmological, not meaning outer space, I'm talking about the cosmos in here, the way in which we are reflections of a holistic worldview, and the values that are subtly taught to us, not explicitly, but the values that are subtly taught to us are reinforced through in every way, you know, through the language we use, through the ways we interact, through the very structure of the classrooms we sat in as children,
Hmm.
you know, and through every conversation that we hear, those values tend to be reinforced until we really become kind of mindful enough to challenge them.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, I think subtlety is a really good word for that reality of, I do think that there is this ongoing under layer, under the narratives that we're taught, under the way that we behave and what we are told is the right way and what is not the right way to behave. I do think that there's this subtle, pervasive um, tendency towards domination that is intrinsically burrowed into our spirit. And I think part of the reason why there is such a immense amount of people who are um, depressed and anxious and who deal with such a variety of mental health issues, which are mental health issues, but they're also spiritual issues as well, that are deeply um, extended from these subtle things that we are taught, which are ultimately anti human. Um, and anti the divine nature that's within all of us, which I think is part of the reason why we have so many of these physical manifestations that we call illnesses, because they're ultimately, it's our body's way, again, of body wisdom, our body's way of saying, this doesn't sit well with us, with everything that is you, me, and all the people that create us. We are, again, we're not individual people. We actually are an extension of a lineage of people. our
Mhm.
parents, their parents, all the people that they ever had a love affair with, all the people that they like to read, watch TV, sing with, the people that that they've met along the way on the streets, everywhere, all the animals, the plants, what they consume. Um, a mother really manifests that a lot, and particularly when she's carrying a child, because they eat the same things. They have an intense
Yeah.
form of
Yeah.
interbeing, and so I think recognizing that interconnection, and naming it in that framework, I think is good, because then it allows for us to take the arts, to take these avenues of tapping into the innermost parts of our human experience, really allow us to kind of take that and work it out and massage it into the way it needs to be, um, so that people are empowered to tap into that divine nature, that creative force, that cosmology that's more healthy and more robust. And and I think part of that is how we educate people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I often think I often teach that concept that you described through the Buddhist concept of no self, anatma.
mhm,
And so it's this notion that it's not that you're not, it's not that the self doesn't exist. It's the notion that really when we examine who we are, we cannot accept, we cannot describe ourselves in any way at, that is isolated from anyone else, right? So, and you described it really well. You're talking about this kind of lineage in time that gives rise to us, and it's not just physically, right? It is through our DNA, but it's also through relationship and through, through sort of you have sort of intellectual and spiritual ancestors as well, right? And all human beings understood this until recently. We all understood. It doesn't have to, we don't have to go to Buddhism. We go to any kind of indigenous culture, and they would have understood this. How we are really our ancestors, and that's in a certain sense. But we're also, in Buddhism, it's understood kind of karmically, and that we are the product of all these relationships and interactions that give rise to who we are. And once we peel all those, if we really want to peel them all away, that's what we're left. We're not left with anything. There's no self beyond those relationships. And it's actually a teaching tool that I've used a lot. What we do is we sort of create these mandalas of the self and think about, our individual selves, our families, our communities, our society, and think of all these things. And then particularly with people who've been taught, and this is one of the most kind of harmful and destructive and oppressive things that's done in schools to people who are in some ways marginalized, is to tell them that everything that's happened to them is because of their own poor choices and it's their own fault. It's done over and over again and reinforced, and sometimes it's done out of love and a genuine need to kind of help people empower themselves and to try to do better. And there is some individual blame in everything that happens to all of us. But it's pretty hard to separate anything that's happened to anyone from all of these kind of myriad relationships and other factors that have happened, good or bad. So so what we do is we take that model and we tell stories and think about, well, let's tell that story from the vantage point of the family or from the society or from the neighborhood, from my street, from the school, from other angles. When we begin to unpack that and begin to look at it in that way, we begin to realize, well, actually, this thing that I thought was my fault or because of what I did was actually because of all these different complex relationships. And it's one of the things that it's one thing to say we want a more just society, and it's one thing to be in the streets working and marching to get rid of Confederate statues, or for healthcare, for all these issues that I believe in strongly. Those things are important too. The thing that we have to do to really prevent more injustice from happening is begin to figure out ways to tell the story in a different way, to tell in a less kind of individualistic, less competitive kind of way. And I think that notion of thinking like really examining, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to say, what is this self that I talk about all the time, that I live my whole life thinking about whether this self is doing well or not well, or whether I'm hungry or thirsty or bored or tired or upset. Like, who is this self? Where does it, how do I define it? When does it end? Does it end at the edge of my skin, or is it in my brain? Is it, or is it in some way related now to you on the other end of this conversation? Because we've had this conversation and there's pieces of you and me and vice versa. So I think an examination of that self would be a useful practice for all of us.
Yeah, I think that's a good practice. And it's funny, I don't hear that Buddhist teaching very often from Buddhists. I don't think it's very popular. Or at least not the Buddhists that I hang around with. But yeah, it's this exploring of the self, and does the self really exist, and or is the self a construct of our narrative? I often say we get so trusting and comfortable with the narrative that we have developed about the narrative that we have, um, and to the point to where I think we delude ourselves into buying into the constructed narrative that we spend a lot of energy and emotion attaching ourselves to, when in fact it's not actually the reality. And part of that is safety. A lot of targeted communities have to do that as a way of surviving in this world, um, or I should say, surviving in this system that we've constructed within this world. Now, the world itself is scary and dangerous and painful, but it's also profoundly erotic, beautiful, invigorating, stimulating, and so it's the both and, the positive and negative. It's creative, and the creativity promotes us or projects us into wanting to create a more just and transformative world. But I think part of that too, that practice of the self, is exploring whether or not our narratives um, are just for the sake of protecting ourselves, so that we can have a way of moving about this world, um, kind of like a metaphorical like weapon. We
Yeah.
weaponize our narrative.
Mhm. Right.
Um, but is that okay to a certain extent? And when is it time to kind of step beyond that and be vulnerable and allowing yourself to maybe deal more I don't want to say healthy, more authentically with the narrative that actually is the narrative of the cosmos.
Mm.
Um,
I think that what's helpful, I think it's really, well said, Jerry, that the way you've described that, because it's hard to navigate all of that. It's really complex and hard to navigate, and there are narratives upon narratives, right? I always used to say, I was in graduate school and we would reading Plato's Cave. I used to always say that, it's a great story, but once you get out of the cave, you just find yourself in another bigger cave, you know? Um, so, there is no absolutely, we've got it all figured out kind of a thing, and I think that the Platonists sort of, fall into that trap a little bit. But I want to say too, that I think that one of the things that's, so that feels a little overwhelming, right? Like, how do we know what's what? But I think what's helpful is to know that, we're always kind of grappling for figuring out who we are and what our place in the world is. We never quite have it absolutely. You know what I mean? What we can know though is what's more fulfilling and uplifting and empowering to us, at least for now. And we can continue to examine the narratives we've been given and challenge them and play with them, and do so in a way that I think what it does is it helps us be a little gentler with ourselves. Like, if we realize that I've done this thing, or my community has done this thing because of a narrative that we've been given that wasn't particularly helpful or useful or healthy, we can be a little more gentle with ourselves. We can realize, well, oh, it wasn't all my fault. I think because as soon as we feel like we're being blamed, then we get defensive and there's not really a dialogue that happens, you know? So I think that, you know, it's useful to recognize that that we are enmeshed in these narratives about who we are and our place in the world. And once we begin to see that those are narratives, we can be a little gentler with ourselves, perhaps, and maybe not as defensive, or not as, yeah, just better, just have a better conversation with ourselves and with others about what's going on, you know.
Yeah, and I really like and appreciate that reminder of being gentle with ourselves. I think that is really, when I talked about the spirituality of nonviolence, or dynamic harmlessness, as the Hindus like to say, ahimsa, is the idea of just that, of recognizing that we are violent people, or we live in a violent culture that teaches us and empowers us to be violent. And one of the most revolutionary acts that you could do is to be gentle with yourself, and to make more space for yourself to screw up, and to be okay with the fact that you screwed up. And that maybe you did screw up, but maybe it wasn't really you that did it. Maybe it was, something happened that triggered it, or whatever. We have to really allow ourselves not just to have that space interpersonally, but have it culturally too. We need to be able to have the space to say that, people have the right to have a bad day. And as Sister Helen Prejean likes to say, nobody is as bad as the worst decision that they've ever made in their life. We are always more. We are always more. And I think for me, part of that, claiming that reality, that more authentic narrative, is how we get out of that cave that's outside of the cave. Because ultimately what happens is, when we create more of that space, when we allow ourselves to be more gentle, when we let people be messy and be a little irritated, we recognize that there's more of an ability to be playful, as you've already alluded to, which I love that. I love that more people are using that word. But also, we learn what Thomas Aquinas talks about when he says that joy is the human's most noblest act. Because when we have more of that spaciousness, we can tap into that joyfulness. Joy is more of a verb and not really a noun, at least in Thomas's philosophy, metaphysics. Yeah. And but then he also goes on and says that the greatest reality of the human person is this, that we are capable of the universe. And I think when we realize that, that's where our inherent nobility comes from, that all of us are noble creatures. In Judaism, they would say that we are noble because we are made in the imago Dei, in the image of God. And what's interesting is that Judaism actually doesn't really actively try to define God, by concept of God, except in the modality of creator. And I think when we tap into that reality, that divinity, that divine nature, that cosmic Christ, the Buddha mind, we can really see more clearly that the most sacred thing that we could do is have our feet flat on the ground, and learn to cultivate joyfulness and companionship.
I would say those two phrases you just mentioned from Aquinas are two of my favorites too. The ability to be joyful in the face of despair, and is the antidote to fascism. Yeah. And the act of it is playfulness, the retention of the kind of like childlike, joyful engagement with the world, because play is telling stories. When I watch my young children play, what they're doing is they're creating stories and they're acting them out. That's what they do all day. They create a whole world and then they knock it down and they start over again
Mm-hmm.
all throughout their day, every day. And that's the thing that is the antithesis of fascism right there. It's not like, you know, uh, specifically, well, it's, I mean, I'm certainly a supporter of leftist politics, for the record,
Yeah.
but the actual antidote isn't just like specific policies, is what I'm trying to get at. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, that's not like, and those policies can be good or less good, but that's not really the antidote. Is what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting is the ability to maintain playfulness and you know, joy in the face of those who would kind of, you know, reduce our world into kind of you know, something that's kind of really, again, going back to the beginning, we were talking about, reduce the world down to 2 dimensions, you know, lose all its depth and texture. You know, I think to be able to wrestle with that complexity of a world and that paradox of a world, you know, I think that's a lot of what artists do. Artists, the role of the poet for me is to be able to like wrestle with that paradox and not necessarily need to resolve it, but be okay with playing with the paradox. And that's the thing that, you know, the kind of, you know, the fundamentalists or you know, in terms of religion, or the fascists in terms of politics won't do. They won't do paradox, and they won't play. And those are the things that I watch the protests and see what's happening out there. The most effective protests are play. You know,
Mm-hmm.
those are things that move people. It's, you know, and those things are powerful and important. I absolutely do not go with the kind of, you know, centrist mainstream politicians who think it's only policy that changes the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because those same people who say that would have never changed the policy if they didn't see the protests in the streets. You know,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the perfect example of that, or the perfect embodiment of that, is the late Representative John Lewis, who spent his first part of his whole life in the streets doing that
Mhm.
work,
Yeah.
and then he continued on that work into the House of Representatives as a congressman, and um, and he was like, you know, I did that part. Now it's time for me to do this part and let other
Yeah.
people continue that other part. It was not a shift like other folks have done. It was a continuation.
Yeah.
And I think your thing about a creative protest, creative resistance, I think is a good point. One of my favorite protest stories was at Stonewall, when the Stonewall uprisings happened. Um, all the street folks who really started the uprising as a pushback against the police
Mhm.
was they got together and um, and began to sing and to dance, and they formed a chorus line, and they were singing, "We are the Stonewall Girls, uh, we do not shave our hair," or something like that. We do not shave our pubic hairs, and it's so funny. The lyrics are somewhere online. Somebody has to look them up. Maybe I can find them when I upload this video. But it it's funny because the cops didn't know how to deal with it, because
Right.
all they know how to deal with is fear and domination. But when we confront that and when we declare our joyfulness, when we prophetically stand in the playful, um, and allow ourselves to be prophetic and not pathetic, um, we we are basically tapping into to the divine, to the God force, what Richard Ward calls the love force. Um, and I think uh, we don't realize that when we're doing it. And we don't realize how available that is. It's not something that only happens in church. Worship doesn't only happen in church. And in fact, it shouldn't only happen in church, or it shouldn't only happen in our private ritual time. All those rituals that we do should lead us into having an awareness that worship is happening constantly all around us. If we have only eyes to see and ears to hear, what the Spirit is saying to the church.
And it requires a reimagining of the sacred, I think. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and I think that's you know, a word that's worth reclaiming. I think it's for me in many ways. Thinking about the question of what is sacred is among the most important questions anyone can ask. And I think when you have what I would suggest is that we have a culture, a civilization in which very little is sacred,
Mm,
and so much is therefore easily exploited or dismissed. And the ability to find the sacred in the mundane, I think is how you get to the place where you're able to have that sense of ability to worship anywhere. You know what I mean? It feels to me like, you know, there's not much point in going to the church or the temple to worship if we can't find what's beautiful and sacred and worthy of love outside of those doors, you know. So it's not to say there can't be an important role for that, but it feels to me like the ability to see the sacred is and recognize the sacred all around us is about as important a question as we can ask, particularly given the way that our civilization approaches the world today.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I think you just alluded to a everyday example of what worship is like with your kids, of how they tell stories and they create stories. They're basically just being little gods, little
Mm-hmm.
manifestation. They're
Yeah.
deifying, they're
Yeah.
growing into their deity, and they're growing into their imago Dei. And it's beautiful because ultimately that's what the divine does: creates, plays, has fun, makes love with us, falls in love with us. And I think, again, it goes back to what you said in the beginning: falling in love, intimacy, learning to live deeply. Thich Nhat Hanh says, if you want to truly live, you have to look deeply within. And that doesn't just include ourselves, it includes the world around us. And I actually want to use that as a transition into talking about the final thing I want to chat with us about, because we're coming to the end, and that is the Wisdom Project. Uh, can you tell us a little bit more about that? What's going on with that? How can people tune into that? And also, you've alluded to the fact that you're a poet and a writer. Tell us about all of your books so that we can buy all of them.
All of them. Well, the easiest thing to say is to go, I think, to my personal website, which is theodorerichards.com, and all the books are there. So, yeah, that'd be probably the easiest thing to do. And as far as wisdom projects, so about 11 years ago now, I moved back to Chicago, and started a nonprofit called the Chicago Wisdom Project. And our aim was to kind of reimagine education, to think about teaching people in a more holistic way, a way that was less focused on testing and these kind of quantifiable outcomes, but focused more on how we can empower people to tell stories, and how we can think of the person in community and relationship, but also as a whole person, not engaging the not just the intellect, but also the body, one's creativity, you know, one's emotional life. So, there was a number of different things that we did to create these kind of learning processes for young people. And the other side of the work has always been that we've wanted to create curriculum and work with people to kind of help further that process of reimagining education, because fundamentally, we have a school system, an education system that's largely based on certain metaphors. It's like the metaphor, a school is essentially a classroom, essentially a metaphor for the world. And really great holistic educators, like, say, for example, Maria Montessori, understood this, and she created a system in which we understand the classroom is a little world. And if we create certain parameters and boundaries, and it's actually a lot of structure in a Montessori classroom. People think it's a free-for-all, but it's not. It's a lot of structure there. It's just that there are free choices within that space, right? That's how we learn, by making free choices within a space, but a space that's kind of created with certain values in mind. Now, the problem with most of our schools is the values are embedded in the classroom, and they're so deep in our civilization and our culture, we're not even aware of the values that are there. The values are of, this capitalist, individualistic competition. We have No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top and all these other policies that have been put into place to create more competition, rather than sharing and learning together. And of course, there's the model that's based on the Industrial Revolution, this mechanistic world in which things are the whole world is the metaphor is that the world is a product to be exploited rather than something that's living and sacred, as we talked about before. It's how, if you look at a typical kind of high school, like the one I went to anyway, it was structured in the same way that a factory would have been structured. We were put on a conveyor belt and moved down the line to deposit little pieces of math and social studies and science in us, and the other metaphor I think that we have for our schools is the prison. And that's a lot. It's actually a really Augustinian concept. If you think about the prison, it's very much rooted in this notion that our world is something to escape, just like schools is something to escape, and our communities are something to escape rather than to improve. And schools are increasingly, in certain communities, are increasingly punitive, and based on this idea that those are a successful escape and the rest of them are headed to the military or jail or something like that. So we wanted to create an alternative to that, and not just for the individual students in our program, but to create a model that other people could apply. And so we worked for many years. I worked writing and teaching and talking about this stuff. And in recent years, we've expanded. We've connected with folks in Baltimore. There's now a Baltimore Wisdom Project, and we're now a national organization called Wisdom Projects Inc. And we work with different educators, universities, youth programs in different places to try to create these different kind of ways of thinking about education. And the core value really is that everyone has a story to tell, and that the work of the educators to create a space in which that story can be told and in which we can all learn from it, rather than just sort of depositing information in a person. So we're really entering into a new phase of that work. And you can find out more. We have a couple of different, we have ChicagoWisdomProject.org is one way to find out. And there's also BaltimoreWisdomProject.org. So you can find out about those two programs through that.
That's so cool. And, really truly prophetic and needed and divine. It's sacred work for sure. Do you have a poem or a passage of your book that we could end with that you really like?
Yeah, I could. I probably could. I hadn't thought of it, but I'll do it.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but
no, I'm good. I've done this before. Let me so the book I have in front of me here on my desk is The Great ReImagining: Spirituality in an Age of Apocalypse. So I'll read a little piece from there. Actually. This one has my notes in it, so I'm going to read from this one. All right. Apocalypse is a rite of passage. For millennia, we have watched our children come into the world and cut the umbilical cord, recognizing that this is an act that has repeated itself and will repeat itself countless times. From singularity, new forms arise that become separate from the mother who birthed them. Paradoxically, this very insight teaches us that we are never really separate. Our shamans learn to break through the cosmic barrier to reveal new ways of understanding our place in the universe. And we celebrated the passage of time, birth, coming of age, death, with our rites of passage celebrations. In the apocalyptic moment, we experience a collective rebirth, a collective rite of passage. We break through the cosmic barrier to uncover a new cosmology, a new consciousness. And what would this new mythos look like? Although we cannot know for certain, we can imagine it. And in some cases, we can even remember it, for there are elements of the new mythos that are as old as the cave paintings. We can only approach this edge with an honest unknowing. To pretend otherwise is to court the hubris that has brought with it so much trouble in the first place. We must also do so with a sense of genuine power, not the power of false and shrunken egos that need to own a world that they cannot feel a part of, but the power of a people who bring with them an entire cosmos of wisdom, the power of a people who come from the stars that can make worlds with their words, their minds, their hands. At the edge of the world, we must find also the courage to leap into the abyss, knowing that there is no alternative but to be reborn.
Amen. That's awesome.
Thanks.
See, this is why I'm so happy I have friends like y'all. Because I would never have been able to write that. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Theodore, for being a part of this and for all that you're doing in the world and being a guest on the show. And yeah, I am always in awe of your work and everything that you're doing, and I find a lot of hope. You know, you and the Baltimore Wisdom folks and the Chicago Wisdom folks always shine a really nice light that is really, really beautiful. So keep on keeping on, and I hope a lot of people buy your books because they need them in their life.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jerry. It was great being with you.
No problem.